over 180 people died as a result. The fine imposed on PG&E was around $3 million. So it turns out white collar is a hugely expensive problem for society. So the FBI does estimates on this. The latest estimate that they put down is that white collar crime, you sort of take all the white collar crime conducted in the United States, it costs us around $800 billion in economic loss every year.
$800 billion?
$800 billion. And to put that in context, that is about 20 times the impact of like all other criminal activity combined. So from that perspective, you might say like, well, this is a huge problem.
Does the punishment fit the crime?
No.
In the sense that I'll just use United Healthcare because it's right at the top of my head, right? Where you're potentially denying all these claims and who knows how many people could have suffered adverse consequences, financial ruin, death, all those kind of things. And the punishment might not even be there. Like, does the punishment generally fit the crime in your mind?
So at the organizational level, I'd say no. In the corporate context, though, I mean, I think this is a constant worry is that the punishments not only don't sort of meet the crime, they like fall wildly, like vastly below what we would expect. So PG&E is a good example of this. This is the utility company out in California. PG&E has pled guilty to causing several of the largest wildfires in California history, including something called the Camp Fire in 2017. It destroyed literally multiple towns that just don't exist anymore. Over 180 people died as a result. So PG&E has pleaded guilty, and they've actually pleaded guilty to manslaughter, to causing the death of 185 people. And I don't have the punishment offhand, but I want to say that the fine imposed on PG&E was around $3 million.
What? That seems like...
Oh, even worse than that, there's reporting that PG&E was initially offered the chance to plead guilty to arson. Now, arson is bad, but it's not nearly as bad as manslaughter. So, why wouldn't you plead guilty to arson? Why would you take manslaughter? It turns out the way California sentencing law is written is there's a cap on how much of a monetary penalty you can impose in manslaughter. Whereas arson, it's just however much damage it caused. Now that makes some amount of sense when we're talking about human beings causing the death of other human beings, right?
Right.
Because you can put them in prison, but you can't put the business in prison. So PG&E actually went for the much worse crime precisely because it got them a much lower sort of punishment in the end, quote unquote punishment.
When you look at enforcement, what's the difficulty? Finding out about it or proving that somebody did it on purpose?
The proving of white-collar cases is really hard because central to criminal law in general is what we call mens rea, right? It's the guilty mind. It's the mental state. And so the question is always, can you show after the fact, based on usually just paper records, that somebody was intending to deceive, right? Was trying to defraud, as opposed to just like, I made a stupid business decision.
I don't think I'm going to ask this question very well, so this may take a minute. But if you were to look at the instances in which there's a debate between were they doing something illegal or were they doing something stupid, what % of the time would you say, oh no, they were actually just stupid, versus no, they just used that as a cover-up because they were really doing something illegal?
Right, the illegal versus stupid is like the complicated, it's a cheesy way to put it, but that's like the complicated theoretical question, right? What was their mental state? On the other hand, like those are borderline cases, but just because there's dusk and dawn doesn't mean there's not night and day. And
right.
Oftentimes when you look at these cases, the defendant is going to want to say, oh, I was being stupid, unintentional. And it's not a he said, she said. It's shocking how many times you can find records where it's very clear the person knew what they were doing. In fact, they say it all over the place. We had a series of cases a few years ago with some different financial traders. One of the traders actually said, like, let's go commit some securities fraud in the chat, right? So like, Oftentimes there's more evidence than people appreciate. And the way I sort of would describe this is it's hard for the government to detect fraud sort of generally if it's just floating out there in the ether. But the moment they get wind of anything suspicious at all, it turns out that they're really good at being able to figure out was there fraud here or not. So they tend to bring cases where they're able to build a story. So I would say most of the time you see a case successfully brought, it's because prosecutors have pretty solid evidence that we have definitely crossed the line here.
Yeah.
And because there's enough of those cases, for the most part, they don't tend to take a risk on the really borderline cases where it's unclear.
When you look at white-collar crime, like confined it to kind of the big ones, so to speak, is it usually just one person, or is it no, it's the whole system business?
So when you see fraud, it tends to take two forms. Either it's the random person inside the company, or maybe the random couple of people who are, for whatever reason, trying to skim something for themselves, or maybe they, got over their skis and are trying to crawl back. So it tends to be a handful of actors. That's case number one. Case number two is much more rare, but it is a real phenomenon, and that is where the harm really is sort of corporate in nature. And by that, what I mean is it really is sort of built into a corporate culture. It's deeply felt. It kind of keeps being carried out by not just a set of individuals, but coming through leadership. And in fact, in the United States, we have something called corporate criminal liability. It's it's a subset of white-collar crime. And it turns out, in the United States, a corporation can be convicted of a crime, just like a human being can. And we've done this for a long time. We've done this going back to the early 20th century, but it reflects that second group, right? That sometimes there's crimes that aren't like the random bad actor. It really does seem to be like the bad barrel is driving this kind of misconduct. It's more rare, but it's definitely a big thing.
Is there an example that you can think of right off the top of your head? The one that jumps to me is like Wells Fargo, when they were like creating accounts for people or something along.
Yeah. So, as it turns out, my expertise is in corporate crime. So I can think of a bunch of examples, but let's roll with Wells Fargo. It's a great one, right? Wells Fargo, what's going on is you've got a massive scandal where fake accounts are being created on behalf of customers. It's causing harm to the customer. It's causing all sorts of chaos. So what's going on there? It's not that you got some random, customer sales rep who's just generating millions of these things. All of the reps are doing this. Why are all the reps doing this? Well, you take a step back, you look at the internal compensation system at Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo basically said, look, you got to hit a quota of new accounts or you get fired. And we're not telling you need to break the law, but we are telling you that it's almost impossible to hit your quota unless you're doing something unethical, right? And that starts to look more like it's not a bad actor, right? It's just anybody who gets a job there is likely to fall into this kind of trap. So we see this at Wells Fargo, but other big companies, we see a lot of this plaguing Boeing over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. We saw this with BP earlier in the mid-aughts. British Petroleum, right? They had the Deepwater Horizon spill in the early aughts. It's a huge national story. If you look at the 5 years before that, BP, I can't remember the exact number, but BP had a bunch of regulatory violations, right? The kinds of things that aren't quite criminal, but are suggesting something's going wrong. BP had something like 97% of the violations for the entire oil and gas sector. Right? You think about somebody like, Exxon, right? The poster child of bad actors at one point in history. They had one violation and BP had 715 or 716 or something. So you can see how an entire industry says part of the problem is if you're not going after those people, you make all of us look bad. Right? So other insurers, I'm sure, are sort of screaming to the rafters of, hey, if we don't look anything like United Healthcare, maybe that says something about them, not about the insurance agency.